Yo, welcome back everybody to a brand new video here on the second channel. And to ring in the new year, I thought I would look at the current top 10 best decks in the format at the beginning of 2025, looking at how the meta has evolved since not only Toronto, but also the Osaka Champions League. Now, if y'all are new here to the channel, make sure to subscribe down below. We're getting very close to 19,000 subs. I think it'd be really cool if we could hit 19K subs today on the 1st of January. I think that'd be pretty hype. So if you enjoy the content and want to help me reach that goal, make sure to click that subscribe button down below. If you're going to enjoy the video, leave a like and all that good stuff. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into the top 10 best decks to play right now. All right, at the number 10 spot, I have Maron EX. Now, Maron does still have a lot going for it right now. It's still a very good 2/2/2 deck. It's still very fast, still very powerful, can donk the opponent, but the deck has fallen off significantly since it, of course, did have a pretty big splash at the Sacramento Regionals. I think this deck, well, it is still very good, it does suffer from some bad matchups. I think a lot of the decks getting popular right now are just not very favorable for Maridon. There's decks like Archaladon getting popular, Cloth is still out there, you know, Charizard still exists. These are all decks that can be difficult for Maridon to usually beat, but it's still a pretty solid deck nonetheless, right? It has Iron Hands. It's pretty good into something like Gardevoir EX, obviously, which is a good matchup for you. The deck is still very powerful, but does have some bad matchups. That's why it's a bit lower on the list. It's still a good deck, though. I still think it is deserving to be in the top 10, regardless of whether or not the deck has been falling off or not. There isn't really anything you could change about, I think, Landon Kaler's Sacramento regional winning list. I think the deck is still pretty solid. The list is still good. It kind of does what you need it to do. You have the Magneton in there. But it's just, again, a lot of the decks getting popular are just very much against Maridon, and I think that's a bit of an issue. Still not a bad deck, though. You can still run really hot and run over any deck in the format. I think if you still play the deck really well, you're still probably going to have a good time with Maridon. I just think that Maridon is a bit weaker right now because there's just a little bit more sketchier matchups being played within the meta. All right, at the number 9 spot, I got Raging Bolt. Now, Raging Bolt is still a pretty good anti-Regidrago deck. Actually, out of probably all the big basic decks on this list, this is probably the best deck that can beat Regidrago V-Star. Which is, of course, one of the big decks right now. But Raging Bolt does suffer from some awkward matchups right now. Your Cloth matchup isn't very good. Your Zard matchup's never been very good. I think the new Archaladon deck that's getting popular isn't a great matchup. Gardevoir also is popular and is not a great matchup. This deck, much like Maridon, has a lot of strength going for it, but it does have a lot of bad matchups, which is why a lot of these turbo decks are a little bit lower on this list. Turbo decks are still very good. They're fast, they're powerful, they can potentially be one of the big decks in the meta with Regidrago. They just have some bad matchups across the board, and I think they're just a little bit more sketchier to play right now. Raging Bolt is also a lot more linear than a lot of these other turbo decks. Like, at least with Maridon, Maridon can go fast, and it has Iron Hands EX. This deck really is just trying to do one thing and one thing only, flood the board with energies, and then just go kaboom with Raging Bolt, right? There's nothing really fancy about the deck, which I think one of the issues with it, it does feel a little too linear. Still a good deck, and I still place it above Maridon because it at least has a better Regidrago matchup than Maridon has, which is why I got to put it here at the number 9 spot. All right, we have a newcomer in the meta here, and that is Archaladon Diga. This deck is coming off of a pretty hot first-place finish at the Osaka Champions League. This deck is getting a lot of hype right now. Now, whether or not the deck actually converts into a real meta deck, we'll have to see. I think the deck does have a lot of cool things going for it. It actually has a pretty decent matchup against some of the big decks right now. Archaladon alone is a really good attacker against big basics. Then you have the Dialga in the mix, which can make a lot of your awkward matchups better, like your Drago matchup, your Guardy matchup, your Zard matchup, immediately become a lot better when you have the Dialga V-Star in the deck. This deck is kind of scary to play against because sometimes you can just high roll Dialga out of nowhere with the help of Archaladon's ability. Yeah, this deck is very powerful. Now, we're yet to see if this deck can actually make a splash. This is why I do have it lower on the list. The deck is getting a lot of play right now. I think a lot of people are just playing it because they're just bored of the other meta decks right now. They just want to play something different, which is probably why the deck is actually getting as much hype. I mean, it did win a tournament, right, which is also why I just think people might be bored of the format. I would put this deck a bit higher if it actually could back up its results a little bit more than just that first place in Osaka. And also keep in mind, this deck won the Osaka Champions League in the Prismatic Evolutions format when they have Budu, which is a big deal. So we'll have to see how this deck converts going into our current meta. It's still not a bad deck, though, and I'm still going to put it at number 8 regardless. I think the deck still exists. It's just I can't rate it higher yet because, 1, it doesn't have as much results as other decks above it, and 2, we're yet to see if this deck is actually going to be a thing or not, or if it's just like a one-time thing, and it won the Osaka Champions League. Still a pretty good deck, though, and this deck might get even better with Prismatic Evolutions. And at the number 7 spot, I have Turbo Roaring Moon. I genuinely think Turbo Moon is one of the best big basic decks you can play right now. Part of the reason why it's so good is because of the diversity of the one-prize attackers you have access to. You have 3 different attackers outside of your Moon EX that are really good. You have the Baby Roaring Moon, which is, you know, a pretty solid attacker. It's a one-prizer that hits for weakness into stuff like Latias and Mew. Then you have the Koraidon, which is a great attacker versus Pokemon weak to lightning like Iron Thorns, Iron Hands, Miraidon, stuff like that. But I think one of the coolest things this deck can do is using Baby Pekron. Now, you can see there's no Brute Bond in the deck. You're probably like, well, how is Pekron useful when there's no poison? Well, Pekron does have an attack that poisons your opponent's active Pokemon, and then you have to put 5 damage counters on the poison Pokemon. They also can't retreat. The main point about Pekron is that you can knock out little Pokemon in the active spot with your poison attack, meaning that you can deny cards like Pheasantipity and Unfair Stand. One of this deck's like main win conditions against something like Charizard is to literally go Judge turn 1, knock out Pekron, and stop them from being able to use Flip the Script and Unfair Stand. So Pekron is also pretty good. This deck is a well-rounded big basic deck. I think it's a little less linear than Raging Bolt. It's still fairly linear, though, because you're just kind of you're just kind of picking and choosing what you're attacking with. If your opponent's got a big Pokemon in the active, you can blow it up with Moon EX. If your opponent, you know, you're trying to offset the prize trade, you can use Koraidon or Baby Moon. Some updated builds of this deck I have seen been playing like 2 Baby Moons, 2 Koraidons, 2 Pekrons, just to try to capitalize on the one-prizers. You can actually kind of make a one-prize board stay with this deck before you even have to put a Moon in play if you draw well enough, which is actually really cool. It's also one of the things that gives this deck some breadth. It's actually a pretty solid deck right now, and I definitely recommend you try it out. All right, at number 6 is Cloth. Now, Cloth has fallen off a little bit since it really debuted in our format. It's still a very solid deck, though. It's still fast. It can literally win the game before your opponent even gets to have a turn, which not many decks can do right now. And the deck is very powerful. It can do some big damage out of nowhere with Binding Mochi. The deck does seem to have a little bit more weaknesses. I think some of the decks getting popular above it are starting to bully it out of the meta a little bit, like Charizard's never been a great matchup. You know, Dragapult, Iron Thorns, not a good matchup, stuff like that. But I still think the deck is very powerful, right? Being able to win instantly is really good, but its matchup spread is starting to get a little bit more shakier. People are trying to figure out ways to beat it, like Gardevoir is not a great matchup either. That's another deck that's popular right now. A lot of the decks above it are just very good at beating this deck. It does beat Regidrago, though, which is good. It beats all the other big basic decks. I would imagine your Archaladon matchup is, like, fine, too. Like, yeah, the deck's pretty solid, right? It just does a lot of damage. It is very difficult to play against sometimes because they can knock you out around Pheasantipity, Flip the Script. They can win on the first turn with a Pekron if you're not careful. Yeah, it's just a very powerful archetype that you do have to respect still, whether or not, you know, the deck is, you know, legit. It's still a very much a real deck and still a very powerful archetype. I mean, technically, it's the best big basic deck right now. Yeah, I would consider this a big basic deck. I mean, it's got Trobagos and Cloth, right? So this is technically the best big basic deck you can play in the format still. But yeah, very powerful deck, and you still got to put respect on Cloth, whether or not, you know, the deck is starting to slip in popularity and play. At the number 5 spot is Lugia V-Star. Now, Lugia V-Star does, honestly, even now, still feels very underrated in our current format. It did get, what, top 8 almost at Toronto Regionals. It did make ASIM cut. The deck is still good, and it's very much a deck nobody's really respecting still in our current format. Not many decks run Temple of Sinnoh or, like, Hammer. Also, Miraidon's play rate is dropping quite a bit. Miraidon is one of your worst matchups. Miraidon is not as popular as it used to be. You do have to worry about the Iron Thorns variants, obviously, but other than that, I think Lugia is still a very good deck right now. Technically speaking, it can beat almost every deck on this list, except for, of course, a certain deck, which we'll talk about very soon. But yes, I think Lugia is still very good, still very much to be a respected deck. I mean, Gardevoir is starting to get popular again, and that's, you know, a good thing for Lugia. I think your matchup against Drago is also very solid still if they're not playing Temple of Sinnoh. Charizard's not a bad matchup. Like, you just have a pretty good matchup spread right now, and as long as there's a lack of lightning decks being popular, it's fine. Like, if there's only one lightning deck in the format, and even then some people consider that deck to not be very good, then you know what, that's a good thing for Lugia, and I think it still continues to be good. It'll probably get even better with Prismatic Evolutions when we do gain Budu and Regigigas, but for now, Lugia is still a very powerful archetype in our format, and I still want to put it in top 5. Yeah, I think it's still great, and it's not really a bad time to play considering the amount of lightning decks are on the decline. All right, next up, we got Dragapult Iron Thorns. Now, Dragapult is about to become an even better deck with Prismatic Evolutions, but one of the better ways to play it right now, and probably the best way, is, of course, the Iron Thorns build of the deck. Some people believe this deck to be bad. Some people believe this deck to be good. I'm somewhere in the middle. I think this deck definitely is not as good as it was when it was first discovered, mainly because some of its better matchups are starting to slip a little bit. But if Lugia becomes more popular going forward, it's not a bad deck to play either, because you have a pretty good Lugia matchup, mainly because, of course, you play the Iron Thorns. The Toedscruel can still be very effective against Raging Bolt and Regidrago, even though Goldengo is starting to decline in popularity, which is obviously one of this deck's best matchups. It's still, like, a good play, right? Dragapult is still strong. This deck just does a lot of good things. I mean, you can definitely edit your list to how you want to play it. Some builds are playing stuff like a TM Devo in the deck to help against Mir and Charizard, and then some lists are playing something like a Lost City, which can help a lot against a deck like Gardevoir, which Gardevoir isn't a bad matchup, but it can be a bit tricky if they know what they're doing. But yeah, Dragapult Thorn's still a good deck. Very much just, like, I wouldn't really call it a simple deck. It's not really a simplistic deck, but you can win games by just sitting there and doing nothing as your opponent can't play the game, which is kind of funny. But one of the cooler lock decks we've had in a while, and this type of lock anti-meta deck, still good right now, and I would still recommend trying it out if you haven't already. All right, at number 3, we got Gardevoir EX. Gardevoir really rebounded in a big way after Toronto Regionals, and this kind of slow-paced build is starting to get more popular again. Once again, the slow-paced build does utilize the unfair stamp over the secret box, but does still have a lot of powerful attackers, right? You got the Drifloon, the Screamtail, the double Monkey Dory, which is good into the Dragapult decks, the Klefki, which is really good against all the big basic decks. I mean, Gardevoir can kind of cover every single ground. One of the big things the deck is now playing is the Mawile, which can trap your opponent if they're not careful. Trapping your opponent with Mawile is very deadly, and sometimes you can just win the game if your opponent doesn't respect Mawile. It's also really cool against Charizard because you can trap the Pidgeot, and you can force the Pidgeot to Turo itself, which obviously then removes their Pidgeot off the board. Yeah, it's a very powerful deck in theory, right? It's still Gardevoir. If you play it well, you secrets well, the deck is very difficult to beat, and I think that Gardevoir is great if you're somebody who wants to play a deck that's a little bit more slower paced, a little bit more kind of calculated with each play. I think you should definitely give Guardy a try. It's a pretty good deck right now, and it's about to get even better with Prismatic Evolutions, but currently right now, at the beginning of the year, it is one of the best decks in our format. And at number 2, we got Charizard EX. Now, Charizard is one of the most well-rounded decks you can play right now. Obviously, it's going to struggle against Regidrago, but Charizard is still just a extremely strong deck. It can kind of tech for any occasion. Like, Charizard right now might want to consider teching a little bit harder against something like Gardevoir, which is getting more popular. But yeah, Charizard is still really good. It can beat up on some of the newcomer decks, like the Archaladon, which can be beatable. Of course, your matchup against something like the big basic decks, like the Moon, Miraidon, Raging Bolt, pretty good too. Yeah, Charizard is still just a very powerful deck. And again, outside of just having one bad matchup with Regidrago, Charizard is still really good. And I still would put it high on this list, right? Charizard is still going to do Charizard things. We'll see how the deck performs in the Budew format with Prismatic Evolutions. Of course, we don't know if Budew is going to make the deck better or worse, but Charizard still is Charizard, right? It's still very strong. If it sets up against you, it's very difficult to beat. Some decks can't really respect and answer a big board of Charizards, and ultimately, Charizard is still very good, right? Just outside of that one bad Drago matchup, the deck is powerful. I mean, even then, you can still beat Drago. It's not unwinnable, but it is tough. But yeah, Charizard is still a very good deck, and, you know, if you play it well, you know what you're doing, you know the lines and matchups, this deck is still very good. And I think, again, if you can kind of put cards in your deck to tech for certain matchups, like the Guardy matchup, Charizard is a very good play right now. All right, before we get to number 1, I do have a few honorable mentions I wanted to highlight here. The first one was Goldengo EX. Now, Goldengo has fallen off a little bit since its run in this format. The deck is still pretty good, though. I think it's honestly an underrated deck right now, but it just kind of slips a little bit. It does have some bad matchups, like against Dragapult Thorns, which is an atrocious matchup. Control and Stall are not good matchups either. Those decks are still out there. Ancient Box, another bad matchup, but the deck is still fine against most of the other big decks. You're 50-50 most of the stuff in the format, and it's still a very decent, underrated deck right now. Next up is Ancient Box, like I just said. Ancient Box is not the same deck as Turbo Moon. Yes, you do play, like, potentially Koraidon and Moon, but you're not the same archetype. You're morally just using the one-prize attackers, and this deck is good. You do have a bad Zard matchup, but, I mean, outside of that, your matchups aren't that bad. You're good into the big basic decks, and you can also do some pretty insane damage into other big archetypes like Drago and Gardevoir, which are also solid enough matchups. The deck is good. You just have to kind of build a good Ancient Box list. A lot of decks are either playing the Koraidon, the Walking Wake. Some are playing the Moon EX in the deck alongside the Baby Moon for an extra bit of attack. And then you have, like, the Great Tusk, which some people also play very heavy counts of Great Tusk. So you just kind of have to pick and choose how you build your Ancient Box deck. And then finally is Control. I very much consider putting Control in the top 10. I just couldn't do it, though. I think Control is a very good deck, but the problem with Control over something even like Snorlax, which could have made the top 10, is Control is a lot harder to play, and honestly, Control only does good if a good player plays it. Like, the average Joe is probably going to do better with a deck like Ancient Box, Snorlax, or Goldengo. Not so much with Control. Control is a lot harder to play. It's still a great deck, though. I can very much consider putting this deck in the top 10. It did get top 8 at Toronto. It's still a great deck. It's a very powerful deck right now. It's got a lot of cool things you can do. You can even build a Control deck how you want to build it, which is one of the things that makes it so good. Again, I consider it being in the top 10. Probably I'd put it as the de facto number 11 spot on this list. But I think Control is very good. It's probably the best like controlling stall archetype right now if you're not counting the Dragapult Iron Thorns tech. But yeah, Control's good. Just couldn't warrant putting in the top 10. But yeah, number 11 seems like a good place. But yeah, those are my honorable mentions. Anyways, let's get into the number 1 spot for the best deck in our format. All right, and probably to nobody's surprise, the number 1 best deck in the format right now is Regidrago V-Star. Regidrago is winning a lot of tournaments. It's dominating. It's extremely popular. All the top players are playing it. It's the best deck right now. Is it S tier, though, is the question. I'm not too sure on that one. I don't know if it's quite S tier, but it is definitely good. It's easily the best deck in the format, right? Just whether or not you want to consider it S tier or not. We'll talk more about that when I do a tier list video, but I think ultimately Drago is a very powerful deck in our meta. It can beat anything. Much like other decks, you do have room for, teching the deck out a little bit, like whether or not you want to play the Executor, the Stadium Split, the Temple, or the Jamming Tower, stuff like that. Drago's really good, and like I said, is by far and away the best deck in our current format. Even with some of the decks getting popular, like Gardevoir and Archaladon, kind of getting a lot more popular, the deck still is fine into those decks, and Drago is still Drago at the end of the day. It's still a very strong deck, and you definitely have to respect it no matter what tournament you're playing in. It's still popular, it's still strong, and it is very good. And it is the best deck right now at the beginning of 2025. We'll have to see where it goes with Prismatic Evolutions, but right now it's the best deck in the format. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video here on the top 10 best decks in the meta. What do you think is the best deck, even though it's Drago, obviously? But what other decks do you think are really good right now? And did I miss out on any decks that I could have noted in this video? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Again, if you're new to the channel, subscribe down below. We'll try to see if we can hit 19K subs. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and I'll catch you on the video very soon. Bye.